Hi, I'm Tyler, and this is the Fox Valley Film Critics. In this episode, we're going to be discussing the next in the lineup of the AFI's Top 100 movies, Sunset Boulevard, as well as the most recent Stephen King adaptation, The Dark Tower. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome to the show, brought to you by Groupthink Productions and FVTV. Joining us today is recent addition to the show, our brand new editor, Terry.
Hello.
How's it going, man?
It's going pretty good. Yeah, it's going good. I'm glad that you let me come on for this show because I get to discuss one of what I consider to be one of the best movies from one of my favorite directors of all time, Billy Wilder's Sunset Boulevard.
Sure, and that's where we're going to start. You're just jumping into this really fast.
I am.
Yes, very smooth. So this is specifically something you asked me to talk about. So why don't you give us the brush up on the film, its history? What do you know?
Okay, so this film was released in 1950, and it was a classic noir film. It has all the elements of the classic noir style, the dark shadows, the femme fatale, the seedy characters, things like that. But also what makes Sunset Boulevard so great is it is set in the classic film noir style, but it was also Billy Wilder's critique on what he felt Hollywood was at that time. It was like a scathing review of how he felt Hollywood was. And you see that as the movie goes on. The movie starts with William Holden. He plays Joe Gillis, a down-on-his-luck screenwriter who's trying to come up with a new original idea or something, but none of his stories seem to take. And basically in dodging like some repossession men that are coming to get his car that he can no longer make the payments on because he has no money, he finds this old abandoned mansion off of Sunset Boulevard. And that's when he is first introduced and meets the main character, and as far as I'm concerned, the star that steals the entire movie, Gloria Swanson, as Norma Desmond, a former silent movie star who basically finds out that he is a screenwriter and basically hires, quote unquote, him to help her write a screenplay to bring her comeback into the movie scene.
That's a very, very good summary of the film. I applaud you for such.
Thank you.
So yes, in regards to how the film tends to be discussed, I think that there's kind of two approaches to kind of digging into the film, in the sense that, as you said, it's a satire. It's all about really the kind of see the underbelly of Hollywood, and a lot about how just unforgiving it is, and how it just kind of it leaves you out to dry. It'll amuse you for as much as it can, and then the moment you cease to be relevant, you cease to be able to keep up with the system, it just throws you out, and it leaves you just kind of completely destitute and with nothing left. And on the other hand, it's known as a performance movie with our enigmatic female lead. And that performance is stunning. It's really, really, really good, and it comes along with several of the greatest quotes of film history.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think one of the things, like when watching it, my wife was probably getting so annoyed with me because I kept pausing the movie and was like, "No, did you see that? Did you see that?" And because as you watch it, it's a movie you can watch over and over again, not only just for the story, but as you watch it over again, you start to see these little things that Billy Wilder put into the film that actually show that part of like his Hollywood critique and the old versus the new, and that was one of them. Like that scene when they first, we were talking about Gloria Swanson, when her and William Holden first meet. The way William Holden is talking is he's talking more like the new type of actor. He's portraying his emotions, things like that, whereas Gloria Swanson, when she talks, she's flamboyant and she's talking with her eyes. She's talking like how they used to talk in silent movies before there was sound.
Yeah, it kind of walks the line of melodrama in a really precarious way, but it works perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really good job on Billy Wilder. But can you offer a little history about Billy Wilder, since I don't think most people would kind of be familiar with him nowadays? He's not one of the contemporarily discussed directors from the old days of Hollywood nowadays?
Well, the thing, Billy Wilder, first and foremost, was a great storyteller. And in my opinion, that's what made him a great director. And he was also one of what I also liked a lot about Billy Wilder is he was very versatile. And I'll give you an example with what makes him such a versatile director. Sunset Boulevard, film noir, drama, melodramatic, not a lot of happiness in there. Same thing, one of my other favorite movies by Billy Wilder, Lost Weekend, was also a very dark film about the real effects of alcoholism. But then he also wrote and directed Some Like It Hot with Tony Curtis, Jack Lemmon, and Marilyn Monroe. Almost blew it.
Two very different
right,
Marilyns.
yeah. He took his name from her. So, but yeah, it was comedy and everything like that. So just that to have that kind of directorial range, in my opinion, is what makes Billy Wilder what made Billy Wilder such a spectacular director.
Yeah, and he did a lot of other films too, including like Ace in the Hole and The Apartment. So his career was absolutely stunning. Like sadly, he's one of those directors that's kind of not thrown in the dustbin, but just kind of forgotten by all but the most informed film nerds. But he's not like Frank Capra or someone like that, who people will just like watch the movies in perpetuity nowadays. But I think Sunset Boulevard is obviously probably the exception to that. Maybe Some Like It Hot, but this is definitely. I definitely think it deserves its place on the AFI's list.
Absolutely. And I was going to say, nice segue with the talking about the dustbin, because that can bring us back into some of the other scenes from Sunset Boulevard that prove Wilder's point. Again, when he pulls up to the mansion, he even, as William Gold, as he's narrating, he says, it was like an old mansion that you would see in the stars used to buy in the 1920s, and it was caught in a paralysis, and it was old and decrepit. And basically that was that was, the main character, Joe Gillis, meeting the old, and same thing with like Gloria Swanson. And then you see it all throughout the movie, these little subtle signs. And one of the famous scene is when she has a bridge game with all her old silent movie friends. And
I have such a soft spot for that scene.
Yeah,
I love Buster Keaton. So.
Yep, and that's all. Yeah, he made a cameo, which is also great because you know that Billy Wilder was paying tributes to one of the greats. But at that time, Buster Keaton was a has-been because it was all talkies, and Buster Keaton was a silent film star, and it's like a guy that helped build Hollywood. But the best part too was the quote as Joe Gillis is narrating when he says that. I can't remember the quote exactly, but something about them being like from the dustbin of history, and he called them the wax statues. And which is so, it's great because like you said, it's these guys that helped build Hollywood and make it what it was in the 1950s, but Hollywood got what it wanted out of them and they were irrelevant. But they were huge stars back in their time. Another great scene too with like the metaphor of old versus new is when they go to the studio and she's trying to sell her script to Cecil B. DeMille, and there's a young security guard there, and her butler's like, open the gate, which is played great by Max von Stroheim, who was also a former silent film director from the...
Which is important because his role in the film is he was her director back when he was in the silent days. So it's art imitating life.
Pretty much, which is, to jump ship here, there's also another scene too where there's actually a movie that Erich von Stroheim shot with Gloria Swanson that was a flop, and they're watching it on a projector in the living room so she can relive her glory days on the screen. So it's like Billy Wilder is basically forcing Erich von Stroheim to watch a flop of his, well, Gloria Swanson too, because it was a flop that they both starred in together. But going back to that scene, it was a great way to portray the old versus the new when they go to the studio, because the butler's like, open the gate, and there's a young security guard, and he's like, no, I'm not gonna open the gate for you. And she's like, do you know he's like, you know who she is? This is Norma Desmond. And the young security guard's like, Norma who? And then Norma notices somebody and calls his name, and it's an older male security guard, and he knows exactly who she is, because he was a young security guard at the time. She was a star in Paramount. And he's like, oh, it's Norma Desmond. No, she doesn't need to sign it. She doesn't need an appointment. She's always welcome at Paramount. And it was just a great way of showing like the old versus young, new versus, because the old security guard knew exactly who she was, but the young security guard was like, I have no idea who this lady is, and she was a big star not too long ago.
Do you want to address the ending at all?
Yes, and to address the ending, I have to go back to the beginning, which was a main point that I missed. So the film starts basically with a murder.
Spoiler alert, by the way.
Yeah, yeah. You don't know whose murder at the time, but as the story progresses, you find out because, another spoiler alert, Gloria Swanson is, for those of you who haven't seen it, is crazy. She's very, 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 very crazy.
I think one could infer.
Yeah. But so basically throughout the movie, it's all like the themes in that there's parts where Joe tries to escape her clutches. It's almost like there's parts where it's like it pays reference to Nosferatu. She's like this creature that like she's always got her fingers clutching, and she's always clutching at Joe. As soon as he tries to escape into the new and the young and the vibrant, she pulls him back in, and like so that's how it goes throughout the thing. And towards the end, he meets a young female screenwriter, and they develop a relationship, and she is basically like the light to Norma's dark, and she starts to pull him away from Norma, and basically the ending where you find out whose body it is without really giving anything away, I have to give it away, it's Joe's body, because Norma ends up killing him because he finally was able to break free of her, and it was like all the fans that had left her high and dry, she loved Joe in her own way, and she wasn't going to let him leave like everybody else did.
And then she kind of used that to propel her career again. So.
Yes.
So yeah, the final dark statement of this very dark and somewhat depressing but fun film. Mm-hmm. That's all the time we have to discuss Sunset Boulevard. Join us for the next segment where we're going to be discussing The Dark Tower. Stay tuned.
Does this help at all?
Anything helps, ma'am. Just try to get some sleep now.
I can't sleep.
Yeah, me neither. I'm on my way.
Stephen King's The Dark Tower is a prolific series of novels written by one of the most important writers of the last century, who's been writing for decades now and is going back as far back like the 60s, 70s now. The adaptation of his most recent, the most recent adaptation, The Dark Tower, was written by 4 screenwriters and a director I've never heard of before, and we both have interesting opinions on that. Terry, tell us a little about The Dark Tower. I've never read the books, but you had some interesting thoughts on it.
And in reading the books, I have to say that if you weren't a fan of the books and if you've never read the books, there are some parts of The Dark Tower that, if maybe not even the whole movie, that you would enjoy. Because there are some decent action sequences, pretty, very cool old school gunfights, because it is kind of based off of like the Western genre type deal. But other than that, going in as a fan of the novels, which I read most of them in college, I was not impressed. They butchered the entire story. They basically took like the bare bones of what The Dark Tower was about and made it their own thing, whereas like if anybody who's ever read Stephen King, I mean, Stephen King goes into a lot of depth into his stories, and that was missing. They basically took 8 huge novels that total almost 5,000 pages altogether and tried to condense it into a 95-minute movie.
Wow, that's just terrible. I mean, okay, so I had very low expectations going into this. It looked cheap. It was surrounded by stupid controversy from the get-go. I did not go into this assuming I was going to like it. I found myself really liking the concept of the film. I think I could be misreading what the concept is because I haven't read the novels, but the story is young kid from New York City having dreams of this potential conflict happening in another universe, and he gets drawn into this conflict between a gunslinger and a man called the Man in Black. and he's kind of going, and as far as I can tell, most of the plot's supposed to be kind of a metaphor for his grief, because we find out very early in the movie that he lost his father. And I was just kind of sitting there in the theater and just kind of analyzing this, like, okay, this is a really kind of neat metaphor. So he misses his father, so he's kind of going into this world where his grief is kind of getting played out through the metaphor of this cowboy fighting the embodiment of death. I was like, that's a really neat concept. I could see someone who's like a really talented screenwriter kind of hammering out with it. But they don't. They just kind of hammer out this like really shallow, thin, 90-minute action movie that it doesn't qualify as like a bad movie, I don't think. It just qualifies as like a really shallow, mediocre studio movie.
Yeah, and as far as the action goes too, a lot of the action scenes were over before they really got started.
They weren't even like well-shot action scenes. Like the whole point of the gunslinger is that he's supposed to be like this incredible gunslinger who can do some incredible stuff, but it's all shot in like quick takes, and it's edited really jumpy. So there's no weight to any of the action. There's nothing like. Go back and watch the old spaghetti westerns. You would see the gun and the person dying in the same shot, so there was an immediate like brutality of the death. Or, even if you don't see them in the same shot, there's still the way they would edit it is based on that brutality. So the fact is that it just feels like it's a movie like buffed to a blinding sheen so that it could be sold to an audience. But
yeah, and the thing too with the fight scene too, the one fight scene in the forest. I won't describe what he's fighting, but it was dark. It was really dark. You could hardly see what it was that he was fighting. And then it was like just as it started to get gripping, it was over, and you're like, oh. And then it's like, on to the next scene, let's go. And it's like,
sure.
Yeah, it's like it was like you said, it was just like they were quick cutting to like it was like okay, I read the novels. Where's the Cliff Notes? Let's go off the Cliff Notes. And
this is the Cliff Notes version, exactly.
Yeah, it's like,
so like you get the sense watching this that this is a really interesting idea, and I get the sense I really want to read the books now because this seems like a really cool concept. Like I know the big kind of, I guess the implication of the books is that this is supposed to connect all of the Stephen King novels together to some degree.
Somewhat. There's some that do, but I'll go ahead and
because I don't know. I don't think it's a huge spoiler, but the kid has. Can I say what he has?
Yeah, and that's one of the gripes that I have. So go ahead and say what he has.
The kid has The Shining.
Yeah. But that is, in my opinion, that was just a cheap, like blatant, like, because in the books it's called The Touch. It's not called The Shining.
Okay.
And same thing when I'll do another spoiler, when they're in the forest and there's an abandoned amusement park and one of the rides is called Pennywise. Like the shoving the Stephen King references they weren't even skillfully done. It was just like every scene that they could do was like trying to say, this is a Stephen King novel, this is a Stephen King novel, this is based off a Stephen King novel. It's like...
But you can't build any sort of logical implications based on that, though.
Yeah.
Like, so apparently that Earth is just a different version of the It universe? It's like
so basically, from what I got from that is maybe because the whole thing with the Dark Tower, the novel itself, so the Dark Tower, basically the synopsis of the story is the Dark Tower protects all these other realms. So it's basically like different dimensions and other realms. It protects all these other realms from the demons and monsters that live outside of the realms that are trying to invade. That's what the Dark Tower is there to protect.
Yes.
And Roland Duchamp, who's the gunslinger, his family is a long line of the gunslingers that are set to protect the Dark Tower from falling, to keep those demons at bay. So basically, yeah, that's... I lost my train of thought, but that's the thing, is like basically the man in black is trying to destroy the tower to unleash Armageddon upon all the realms of the world, and he's, Roland is like the last line of defense between him doing that, and Jake comes into play because he's got The Shining, and it's got, the Shining is strong with this one, much stronger than the kid from The Shining, apparently. Yeah, so he comes into play, and he's trying to help Roland do it, and to help Roland stop the man in black from destroying the tower and unleashing because basically his psychic powers are enough that he can potentially destroy the tower.
Sure, and as I said, this is a great concept. I like what it means thematically. I love everything it's set up. I know nothing about these characters. I know nothing about why these people want to do what they do. from the movies, not the books, why does the Man in Black want to destroy the tower? Why does he want to unleash Armageddon? He does not stand to gain anything from doing so. None of his henchmen stand to gain anything from doing so. I get Idris Elba because you clearly like he's probably the best thing in the movie. You can sense like the loss, and you can sense like that he's lost something. But it's also condensing a very long story down, so it just turns into Thor. So it's guy who doesn't belong to Earth, doesn't understand Earth things happening for like half the movie.
Yeah.
And then and the kid is the worst one because you can tell he's supposed to be the emotional core, and it's all supposed to be about his grief, about him dealing with all this stuff. And we don't learn anything about who he is. We just know, oh, he's grieving, he's sad. Now he is going to the alternate Earth. It's like,
and
tell us something about him.
And see, and the whole time I was watching this movie, I'm like, where is Frank Darabont? Where was he? Was he busy? Because Frank Darabont, who has done a couple of Stephen King adaptations, The Green Mile, The Mist, and if I'm not mistaken, I also thought he did Shawshank, but I could be wrong. But he stays very true to Stephen King's source material. He stays true to the books. And like I said, you know you're going to have to cut out some because Stephen King goes very much into depth. But with Nicholas Arlage, I think, or Arklage is the director of the Dark
I've never
Tower.
heard of him. That's why I was joking.
He wrote The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. I did a little bit of research.
The American or the Swedish one?
I think he wrote the Swedish one. Because
Okay.
he's from, I forget, Austria, if I'm not mistaken, something like out there.
Well,
so.
the movie has 4 screenwriters.
Yeah,
So
and
unless you're the Wizard of Oz, that's the kiss of death.
And that was the thing. He cut out characters from the 3 books that I read of the 8. There was also another main character in the book that gets pulled into that universe, and that's the thing. There were no portals in the book either. That's, and then the way that Jake actually goes into that other world is a lot different. It's very different than the movie. He actually, in the first book, he's actually murdered, and that's what transports him to that other world, which also leads to another great, see, they just left out so much character development, like how you were saying with, you wanted more between Roland and Jake. There is a point, because Roland is so consumed by killing the Man in Black, that there's actually a point in the novels where Jake is going to fall off of a mountain and Roland has a chance to save him. And so like Roland's hanging on to Jake, the Man in Black is over there, and the Man in Black says, I'm going to give you a choice. You can either save the kid, or you can find out more about your destiny, and Roland lets him fall. Spoiler alert in the book. It won't be a spoiler alert for the movie because they cut that out like most of the other parts of the novels.
Well, yeah, that's interesting though. I want to dig into this now because it's a really cool concept, and it's so badly like I know the obvious kind of way to jump on this is just to say it looks cheap and it's poorly shot, but honestly, all of that could be alleviated if the script was right. If I cared about this kid. Because the CGI is not bad. This is not a badly shot movie. This is a competently made movie that just doesn't look good.
Yes, and that's the thing too. Like, you know, to go to a different reference, but it's also one that's based off of a series. If you look at Lord of the Rings, nowhere near in size because you know Stephen King wrote 8 novels about the Dark Tower. The Lord of the Rings was 3. Peter Jackson churned out almost like, 12 to 16 hours worth of movies on that and stayed pretty close to the book, and you take 8 novels, like 8 full novels, and make a 95-minute picture with all that depth of information and that wealth, the wealth of knowledge and character development that was in those books. It should have been at least a 2.5 to 3 hour movie.
This should have been a TV show.
Yeah, or a TV show, yeah.
That's all the time we have for this segment. Join us for the following segment where we'll be discussing his movie recommendation for the week. Stay tuned.
Good coffee, huh? Oh my God! What are you doing in my apartment?
Hello and welcome to our final segment. Now Terry is going to take over and offer us his movie recommendation for the week.
So I kind of went along with the theme of great storytelling in movies. For this for my movie recommendation, I ended up picking Stanley Kubrick's 1971 film A Clockwork Orange, which is an adaptation of the 1962 book by Anthony Burgess of the same name, which probably is one of my favorite books. I've read it at least 4 or 5 times, and it also is why it's one of my favorite movies. To give you a brief synopsis of what the movie is, it's set in a dystopian future in Britain. The main character is Alex, and he has his 4 members of his gang, or his droogs, as he calls them. And basically every night they go out for what they call a bit of the old ultra-violence, and they're degenerates, they're heathens, they're violent, they're criminals, and it's basically just them. It's going out and running amok on the town, vandalizing, stealing, just everything. And that basically the story ends up culminating into Alex commits his first murder and goes to prison, where to get out of prison he becomes part of a very new experiment to help weed out the violence in the society, where he gets conditioned to become sick at the sight of violence, and it basically goes on to that, and then where he gets cured from that too and goes back kind of to his old ways. But what, so get my thought here. It's a great movie, well shot by Stanley Kubrick, one of his best films, and it's very fast and intense, and there's a lot of action, and it also portrays a lot of drama, and it's also like, it also begs the question of when Alex goes through the treatment, is violence necessary in humanity? And it's very interesting as to like how they ask that, because the whole movie, when Alex is committing violence, you're appalled by it because it's just so graphic. Like the violence that him and his droogs are committing is basically just for fun. Like he's a sociopath and a psychopath. He has no emotions or remorse. This is just what he does. But by the end of the movie, when he's sickened by violence, he basically doesn't even do violence for his own self-defense, and you begin to ask, like, is it necessary? Is violence necessary in our human society?
Fun story. I think I saw that movie slightly too young to really get it. I think I was like 17 or 18, so I was pretty squeamish at the time. And I watched it for the first time, and I was like, what is happening? This is like uncomfortable. So I haven't seen it since then, but it's one of those things where I need to kind of see it again, because I'm starting to kind of get much more into the Kubrick films, and that because everything he did was pretty much great. So.
Mm-hmm. One of the great things too, if you're a reader, I would recommend reading the novel, because one of the things I wish Kubrick would have done in Anthony Burgess's novel that really ties it all together, there's actually 21 chapters in the novel. And why Anthony Burgess wrote 21 chapters is because he believed at the age of 21, that's when you become an adult, that's when you grow up. So in the 21st chapter, Alex is supposedly, like in the book, Alex is only 15. And he begins, and in the 21st chapter, he's doing kind of the same thing that he did when he was younger, but he ends up growing up and realizing he meets one of his old fellow droogs, and he has a wife and a family, and Alex realizes that he wants that and ends up leaving the gang to leave the much younger second in command in charge. It was basically him saying that he grew up, and I kind of wish Kubrick would have left that in the film. But it's a great film, and I recommend watching it it's a nice, I guess as nice as a summer watch can be.
Fair enough. That's all the time we have for this episode of the Fox Valley Film Critics. You can find more reruns of the show on the Groupthink Productions YouTube page, or watch more on FVTV. You can follow me on Twitter at NASocialCritI, that's critic without the C at the end, and you can find more of our reviews at the NASocialCritic.tumblr.com. I'm Tyler with the Fox Valley Film Critics. Have a wonderful day.